Okay, here we go. So let's look at some of this and why this social identity stuff we've been learning about, all these different ways of self-identity and intersectionality and socioeconomics and all these things we've been talking about up to this point. Why are they important in geography, and how do we map these things? And so I've taken some of these photos of, or maps, these graphics from chapter 5 in our textbook, so you can follow along in chapter 5. I don't know what page it's on for you, since you can have a variety of different editions of the textbook, but you are looking at a map, two maps of Baltimore, Maryland. So Baltimore, it has a long history of Asian Pacific Islanders. That's an ethnic group that lives in the city, and also Hispanic populations. Now, in this case, Hispanic is an ethnic group, but it also has racial connotations here because there can be many different ethnic groups within what is considered Hispanic. So typically in Baltimore, you're going to find a lot of Puerto Ricans, a lot of Cubans, a lot of Central Americans, and so all of those different places that I just rattled off have different cultures about them. There are some similarities, like language, and often religion is Christianity, Catholicism, particularly. So there are some similarities, but there might be lots of different ethnic representations in Hispanic communities. Asian Pacific Islander are more homogeneous in racial makeup and ethnic background. So, Baltimore has a long history of succession of these populations, and so you can see in Baltimore there is a heavily populated area, heavily Hispanic identified area over here on the eastern part of the city. And you can see these other dark areas also have high percentages of Hispanics among the general population. But what ends up happening, or what we need to understand here from a pattern of succession, is that this area typically is going to be the first go-to area for new immigrants who come in chain migration or step migration to the area. And then once socioeconomic status is achieved, or there's a higher socioeconomic status achieved, you can see that through a long history of succession, people move out of these areas into upper level, higher level socioeconomic places, into other neighborhoods that maybe typically were not traditionally considered Hispanic areas. And the same goes for Asian Pacific Islanders, although please notice that it's not nearly as widespread as the Hispanic community. You do see some heavy concentrations in three places in particular within Baltimore, where you're going to have generations of families who are still bringing generations from abroad to be with them, and then as again the generations pass and children go to USA schools and have USA educations and get, this idea that income, occupation, and education are important, there's going to be some venturing out from the places where you identify with your social group to less, I guess, intentional segregation away from those others that we identify against so often. Okay, and so please notice these patterns, because they're going to be particularly important, not only for understanding why have we been talking about the topics from the first few lectures this week, but also in one of the political geography topics that we're going to touch on this week. I believe it's chapter 8 in your textbook. It's toward the end of the political geography chapter, where it talks about voting and political representation. Gerrymandering is a concept that maybe you've studied in your political science class. It's illegal because it's redistricting, it's rezoning and grouping different districts, redrawing lines of different districts so that your candidate can be successful, for instance. So we'll watch another video. One of the last videos that we watched this week will be on gerrymandering. And so understanding the layout of cities and having this data that we get from the U.S. Census, by the way. The year 2020 was a census year. One of the things the Constitution, one of the responsibilities the Constitution lays out for the U.S. government is it's required every 10-year period to take a census of everybody living in the United States, not just citizens, but everybody living in the United States, so that funding that comes from the federal government can be appropriated properly. So if, for instance, right now there's all kinds of news stories that people are leaving California, moving from California to Arizona to New Mexico to Texas, leaving California, moving to Florida, leaving and going a lot of places. And we found out that information primarily from the difference in population from the year 2010 to the year 2020, and then also looking at trends that have continued since 2020 until today. So anyway, when it's important to look at the way that we appropriate funds and the way that candidates are elected with districts and things like this, because your political views, your political interests, your desires as your social group collectively has with your social group, these things are going to differ from one ethnic group to the next, one racial group to the next, one socioeconomic group to the next. These things tend to differ. And so understanding the layout of a city and understanding what issues might affect this group of people who are heavily populated in this area, or this collection of people who are heavily populated here, the voting people, which of course is limited to citizens currently, it's important to know when you're drawing districts, because if all of these people were within a certain district and had one particular way of voting, but all these other people, were in control of, the politics of the city, then they could get their candidate in, and you would be neglected time and time again. And so districts are supposed to be drawn, just based on population trends. But gerrymandering is something that we look at and study in urban geography, political geography in particular, because of these groupings that we can see, these patterns of groupings and succession patterns and things like that. Okay, so let me move these other two pictures over into the screen. There we go. And here's another. Okay, and so again, these are additional images from chapter 5. Let me see if I can move myself out of the way here. So we're going to see all of the... There we go. Okay, so what we're looking at here is Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and then also New York City, okay? Because remember, New York City is so big that it's got different boroughs, we call them. And so Manhattan is a borough, Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn, Staten Island. These are boroughs of a larger city, New York City. Okay, so let's first look over here at African American segregation in Milwaukee. So these dark green areas are the heavily populated African American areas of Milwaukee. Over 80% of the population in this area is African American. And this happened primarily as African Americans moved into this area during what we call the Great Migration. So after emancipation and in the decades that followed, during Jim Crow, things were easier. Things were more welcoming for African Americans in the North. And so you see step migration happen often from Mississippi to Memphis to Chicago to Milwaukee, or Detroit or other places where there was going to be more liberty, for more freedom for African Americans to live freely in society. And so this is a low rent district because, of course, this chronically discriminated against, the chronically subordinate group, African Americans, just because slavery was over did not mean that they immediately had wealth to fall back on. You had to start from nothing. And so low rent district is typically a place where any migrant group, whether you're coming from outside the country or within the same country, it costs a lot to move anyway. But if you started out with nothing and you get someplace with nothing, then you're going to go to the place where it's the cheapest for you to live. And so you develop a heritage and you develop a pattern and you develop a sense of community in this particular in this particular case. So, so here is the segregation background, essentially, of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, because it still is represented pretty closely to this today. And you see the higher rent district, where some of these are industrial areas too for transportation along Lake Michigan, but the higher rent district, essentially, where you have larger houses or even estates. These are families that have been there for a long time and have a higher socioeconomic status than people who immigrated within the last 100 years, for instance. Okay, and then also a way that you can manifest your intersectionality or another part of your social identity is your sexuality, your sexual orientation. And so this is another aspect of mapping that we can do and plotting in cities that we can do in geography class. So this map here, like we said, is the 5 boroughs of New York City. And the dark areas are the places where same-sex couples declare that they lived during the recent census. And so this map shows that same-sex couples, these happen to correspond to very high-level socioeconomic status locations also. In other words, they are high rent districts. Manhattan in general is very high rent. The shoreline in Staten Island, the shoreline in Brooklyn, etc. You don't see very much in Queens, but there's a posh area in downtown that has attracted a lot of same-sex couples in Queens. And so there is a lot of political power in money and in socioeconomic status, and therefore it is important to know a lot about the breakdown of different places where people tend to congregate, what kind of voter is going to be there, what kind of issues is that voter going to see as important or worthwhile or beneficial, and therefore there's a lot of information that you can get if you're a politician or if you're a policymaker or any of those kinds of urban geography type things. There's a lot of information that you can get from the census data being plotted onto maps and charts about city breakdowns, intersectionality. All your social identity cues are present in are requested. That information is requested in the U.S. Census, and we can plot it on these maps. And believe me, politicians use this information all the time. So if you are interested at all in politics or policymaking or any other industry, really, are you going into the food industry, or are you going to be a translator, or what is it that you're going to do with your life? These issues are important to know and understand. So we'll have one more video this week. I think I'm going to spare you another Mrs. T video, because we're kind of doing a lot of Mrs. T videos this week. So I think Mr. Sin channel has a really good video on gerrymandering that I'll share with you as our last video lesson this week. So I will see you again next week for more topics about cultural geography. I think language is on our docket next.